Hello, my paper today is I Am Here, Cartographic Abstraction and Digital Narcissism in GPS Selfies. And I've placed self-surveillance under erasure there just because I'm going to end up saying a little bit less about that than I intended, I'm afraid. So I'd like to share some ideas I've been thinking about recently in connection with map selfies or GPS selfies. Those screenshots that I know at least some other people also take to record the blue dot that locates us within the cartographic depiction offered by the mapping app as we use our smartphones. I'm trying to think this through in relation to the idea of narcissism, which has entered academic discourse in cultural studies and in mainstream media. Been with us for a number of decades now. So I first want to consider this picture as both cartographic and as a kind of locational self-portrait made using the global positioning system. Then I'll briefly consider narcissism and what it has to add to our understanding of this kind of picture. So I'm considering the blue dot as the entry of the self into the map, such that the digital map now enables a range of ways in which we can visualize and surveil ourselves, as well as to make self-portraits of various kinds. I'm not going to take time to go into the wide range of ways in which surveillance capabilities are coded into smartphones and mapping apps now, because I want to focus in on this idea of picturing and surveilling the self as a narcissistic way of relating digitally and spatially to the wider world. So this might be a lesser modality of GPS. As Stuart Dunn in his book A History of Place in the Digital Age has noted, the power of GPS on the GeoWeb lies in its ability to connect, search, synthesize, rank, and to an extent visualize. But I'm seeing the visuality of GPS as one of the key ways that people in general apprehend and understand GPS. And I think instead we need to take up a more specialist interest in it if we're to appreciate the ways in which it organises data and relationships as the GeoWeb. And I also wanted to bring in the idea of narcissism because I opted to do a talk starting from pictures I took of myself and decided they were so interesting that other people needed to hear about them in this forum. So my argument here is that a few modes of cartographic abstraction are in play here in this picture, and by cartographic abstraction I mean a material modality of thought and experience that is produced through cartographic techniques of depiction. It's the more than visual register that both posits and produces the cartographic world, or what John Pickles has called the geocoded world. And by this I mean the naturalised apprehension of the Earth as a homogeneous space that is naturally, even necessarily, understood as regular, consistent, objective. And I argue for interpreting cartographic techniques of depiction as themselves abstract, and cartographic abstraction as such as the modality of thought and experience that these techniques produce. So abstraction within capitalism comes to be socially real and material, taking place outside thought. And it's that identification of abstraction existing outside of the thought and consciousness of individuals that I pursue in terms of cartographic ways of seeing and knowing. So in this context of GPS selfies, I want to suggest that creating this kind of map-based self-portrait based only on location is a kind of cartographic abstraction, and that the GPS as a whole uses a regime of cartographic abstraction, whereby we, in relation to our GPS receivers, are abstracted as locations in space. And these abstract modes of creating images are combining to yield a way for us to make pictures that reinforces the concept of the isolated individual as the primary social unit in societies based on the capitalist mode of production, which is still, of course, where we live. So the thing that's really interesting to me in this is the way that social forms of abstraction, including cartographic abstraction, recognise abstraction as a social process, meaning it goes on among the social, and this is both how it's able to produce such powerfully useful abstract entities as the cartographic view from nowhere, the view that appears to be above all points of the mapped area simultaneously, the cartographic grid, latitude and longitude, and also the way it points us to action being necessarily social rather than something that the isolated blue dot individual can undertake on their own. So I'd like to start thinking about the picture and how it works before turning to this idea of cultural narcissism. So this is a screenshot, a screen grab, and if we say shot, then it kind of links back a bit more strongly to the idea of photography, to taking your shot, to shooting, as people have been keen to speak metaphorically about cameras as guns for so long. But this isn't a photograph. A digital photograph still works by means of light entering a lens and being registered by a digital sensor. So I think it might be more helpful to think of the image as indexical rather than photographic. Indexicality is one of the foundational concepts in photography theory, and it's drawn from Charles Sanders Peirce's sign theory as opposed to that of Ferdinand de Saussure. Peirce's semiotic theory was tripartite, involving a sign, its object, and its interpretant. And he saw this three-way relation as being irreducible to the semiotic formulation of pairs that Saussure popularized, involving only a signifier and a signified. And there is, of course, a rich literature by and about both Peirce and Saussure that we can't deal with here, but for now we can take up Peirce's concept of signs functioning in three broad ways. They are indexing or indexicality, iconicity, and symbolism. So iconicity is to do with resemblance or analogy between the object and the sign. In symbolism, the relationship between object and sign is arbitrary or conventional, so it has to be learned by the interpreter. And in indexicality, the relationship between the object and the sign is either causal or directional, or we can say contextual, as Paul Frosch puts it, citing Marianne Doane. We have index as trace and index as deixis. So trace is perhaps the more familiar idea, as with smoke, indexing fire through having been caused by that fire, being a trace of that fire, while the indexical relationship to context might be exemplified by a finger pointing at a thing. Deixis is more commonly used in linguistics, and it refers to terms that give contextual, spatial, and relational information, such as here and there, where we can only understand their referent or object in context, or you or she, working the same way contextually. And indexicality has been foundational for photography theory in the sense of index as trace, due to the mechanism of whatever is in front of the lens being exposed to the negative or the digital sensor, as well as for cameraless photography, right, where the photosensitive surface is exposed to the light source without a lens coming between them. So while indexicality has been extensively used in thinking about photography, I don't think it has been used so much in relation to thinking about cartography, because the map as sign is not caused by, so is not a trace of or an effect of what it depicts, but has instead been produced through the combination of many techniques to render the physical world as spatial data, through surveying, i.e. measurement, i.e. expressing the world in the form of numerical data. And then we constitute an image of the world using variously scale, projection, selection, generalization, and symbolization. And Marc Monmonier gives a very good account of those processes. So the map's relation to its object is often strongly iconic, achieving a form of resemblance, and it's always thoroughly symbolic, but I think it has generally been indexical in the form of the in situ map, such as those we encounter in town centre maps and spatial diagrams, which shade into being maps of buildings or shopping centres and so on, right? Campuses, the maps that say to us you are here, and the red squiggles on this are to indicate where that's happening on this town map. So to return to the GPS selfie, an image that certainly makes the claim, either in the present or in the past tense, that I am or was here. How was this image made? So without making use of the smartphone's lens, the screen has become something, I guess, more like an image field or an image surface, rendering visually both the graphical user interface and the data furnished by the mapping app. It's being shown, expressed on this surface, which is transparent, but this image is not recording in the manner of the indexical photograph, something that exists out there in the world outside the smartphone, but is instead recording what is expressed in visual form from within the mechanism of the smartphone. So the screen becomes this field that's ready for capture by the screen grabbing mechanism. And even though the smartphone's camera lens then is not involved, the screen grab indexes a way in which I, as my location, have been indexed via the digital map. So this is the sense in which I think it's more helpful to call this image indexical instead of photographic. So what are the relationships involved in this? I stand in place and I hold my network device. The GPS receiver in my device receives the signals from the minimum 4 global positioning system satellites. The receiver is where the trilateration takes place. The receiver calculates its own position in relation to the satellites. I am co-located with the receiver, so we are here, really. I am not the receiver. It's not yet, thankfully, implanted into me. I can still hand it to someone else and it will keep indexing its own location. So what is depicted and specifically symbolized in the map picture captured from my screen is the location of the GPS receiver in my phone. So I've come to take an interest in the concept of narcissism because of the way in which digital mapping as an everyday encounter seems to me now so extensively involved with depicting ourselves to ourselves for purposes of wayfinding, but also now to simply identify where we are. And the map has, I think, only had that functionality previously in in-situ maps, and now we are the blue dot, and we have a kind of panic button also on our mapping apps that we can press to make the cartographic depiction return to us, right, to put ourselves back at the center of the map when the map has left us. And the location in which we presently exist becomes an active symbolic element in the interactive digital map experience. So Paul Frosch has rightly observed that the accusation of narcissism is one of the most common themes in public discourse about selfies. And the idea of a culture of narcissism was popularized by Christopher Lasch in 1979. And his work was really influential in bringing the concept of narcissism from specialist psychoanalytical use into the mainstream of American culture, or at least bourgeois culture, where it has then taken on the sense of excessive self-regard or self-obsession. In psychoanalysis, Freud first put forward the concept in 1914, and he described a process in which we become subjects by taking ourself as our first love object through incorporating an ego ideal that combines an idea of a parental and societal gaze as well as an ideal of what the self should be, such that in one sense narcissism is a way of internalizing ideals and norms that are important in the subject society. And this is a way in which the subject carries out self-management. And it's also a process, therefore, that inaugurates subjectivity. Freud proposed that the ego ideal is tyrannical, and that a power of this kind, watching, discovering, and criticizing all our intentions, does really exist. It exists in every one of us, in normal life. And this is the aspect of the narcissism process that I guess I'm reading as surveillant, having this internal role of watching and checking the self, which to some extent is necessary, but in the popularized usage of narcissism, it kind of comes to be seen as excessive and antisocial. And Gaetanidis develops the concept of the relationship between self and image by suggesting that we can turn to Lacan, who saw narcissistic identification as an imaginary process of taking on an image and appropriating it as if it represents the self. That is, narcissistic identification is primarily a way of losing oneself in the other. More precisely, the fact that it is at the root of the formation of the ego reveals that the ego is itself specious, a false acceptance of an image as real. Hence, there is a sense in which narcissistic identification falsifies and alienates, with the subject using the object to sustain a fantasy of integrity of the self and cover over its fundamental fragmentation. And Lacan proposes that the gaze is what turns me into a picture. And I think in this context of the GPS selfie, there's a way that we could read the gaze as the radio signals, which are being transmitted to my GPS receiver, which is the location of the process of trilateration, which ascertains my location, and then the process of symbolization of that location data and its expression in the cartographic field of my mapping app, through which I am translated into the image, or with Lacan, am turned into the picture. So I'm not sure whether we should attribute the satellites themselves the position of the other who originates the gaze, or whether it would more properly be the GPS as a whole, or perhaps the institution which operates it, the US Air Force. But the initiator of the operation is still me, controlling the smartphone, choosing to instigate this network of viewing relations among myself, the GPS receiver, the satellites, the US Air Force, and through doing so I create a selfie based only on location data. I create this self-abstraction, a depiction including only my spatial existence in relationship to my device. And I have selected out of consideration other characteristics of my existence in this place. So perhaps I can say there is a mode of narcissism in play here, but it's perhaps less to do with the popularized cultural narcissism version, and maybe more to do with the Lacanian wishing to render the self as picture. So after thinking of my GPS selfie as indexical in its capacity to attest I am here, and now later I was there, and after thinking of it as a result of processes of abstraction in which my location is abstracted away from all other aspects of me and symbolized in the map, and after thinking of the relation I have sought out with the other of the GPS or US Air Force in order to symbolize myself as a picture, the reason I'm still interested in this set of ideas is that it seems to me to render a picture of aloneness via this mechanism's emphasis on creating a symbol of my GPS receiver on its own, whereas conventional photographic selfies often involve pairs and groups of people. The GPS selfie so far appears to be a way of making pictures of the self alone, in which the presence of other people and the relationships and wider social relations and context involved are deselected for depiction, not at the level of the maker of the picture directly, but at the level of the image-making mechanism. So thank you very much, and I would really welcome questions and criticisms.